What happened in colonial South Carolina in 1716 challenges everything historians thought they knew about early American slave revolts. The official records were sealed for over 3 centuries, but recently discovered documents reveal a story so disturbing that colonial authorities deliberately erased it from history. This channel is only for those brave enough to confront the darkest truths about America's past, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the power dynamics of colonial plantations. In the winter of 1716, 14 plantation owners died in what authorities classified as industrial accidents. But newly unsealed documents from the South Carolina Colonial Archives tell a different story. They reveal the calculated revenge of Amina, a woman whose knowledge of ironwork became the instrument of the most methodical and terrifying uprising in colonial American history. The truth was so shocking that 3 different colonial governors ordered all records destroyed. What they didn't know was that private letters and medical reports survived, hidden in family estates for over 300 years. The Blackwood Plantation sat on 800 acres of prime Carolina lowcountry, its wealth built on rice cultivation, and an operation that killed more enslaved people per year than any other recorded plantation in colonial America. The mortality rate was 73% annually, a statistic so horrific that even contemporary slave traders refused to sell to owner Marcus Blackwood. But what made Blackwood unique wasn't just its brutality. It was a massive iron furnace operation that provided tools and weapons for 5 surrounding counties. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian at Charleston University who discovered the sealed documents in 2018, describes what she found as the most detailed account of organized resistance I've ever encountered in colonial records. The papers paint a picture of systematic torture masked as industrial efficiency. Enslaved workers were forced to operate furnaces that reached temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, often without protective equipment, while punishment for the smallest infractions involved being chained next to the blazing iron for hours. Among these workers was a woman known in the records only as Amina, though private letters suggest this was not her birth name. Colonial medical records describe her as a negress of unusual intelligence and peculiar knowledge of metalwork, apparently learned in her heathen homeland. What the plantation owners didn't understand was that Amina came from a long line of Yoruba iron workers, masters of metallurgy whose knowledge of fire and metal surpassed anything the colonists possessed. The first death occurred on November 15, 1716. Overseer Thomas Johnson was found at dawn, his body discovered inside the main furnace, burned beyond recognition. The coroner's report, written by Dr. Elias Whitmore, noted several disturbing details that were later classified. Johnson's body showed evidence of being burned alive over an extended period. More troubling, the furnace had been modified in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of its construction. Someone had created what Dr. Whitmore described as a chamber of prolonged torment, engineered with scientific precision. Marcus Blackwood dismissed Johnson's death as an accident, the result of drunkenness and carelessness around dangerous equipment. But Amina was watching, documenting, learning the routines and vulnerabilities of every white person on the plantation. She had spent 2 years mapping the underground passages used to transport coal to various furnaces throughout the property. These tunnels, unknown to the plantation owners, connected directly to the main house and overseer quarters. What the colonists saw as an industrial facility, Amina saw as an elaborate trap waiting to be sprung. The second death came 3 weeks later. William Crawford, the plantation's head driver responsible for whipping quotas, disappeared during his evening rounds. His body was found the next morning in a smaller furnace used for tool repair, but the physical evidence defied logical explanation. Dr. Whitmore's private notes, hidden in his medical bag for over 3 centuries, describe burns that covered 90% of Crawford's body, yet his clothing remained largely intact. The furnace showed signs of precise temperature control, as if someone had carefully regulated the heat to maximize suffering while preventing immediate death. By December 1716, fear began spreading among the white population of the plantation. James Hartwell, Blackwood's business partner, wrote to his brother in Charleston, "Something unnatural stalks our furnaces. The Negroes work in silence now, their eyes holding secrets we cannot fathom. Marcus refuses to acknowledge the pattern, but 3 men cannot die by accident in identical circumstances." But what the plantation owners didn't realize was that Amina wasn't working alone. She had carefully recruited 6 other enslaved people, each chosen for specific skills that complemented her plan. There was Kofi, who maintained the coal delivery systems and knew every tunnel beneath the plantation. Asha understood the daily routines of every overseer and their sleeping habits. Samuel, a blacksmith, could modify furnace mechanisms without detection. The others served as lookouts, messengers, and diversions. Their operation was more sophisticated than any recorded slave revolt in colonial history. While other uprisings relied on quick strikes and hoped for external support, Amina's group planned a systematic elimination that would appear accidental to authorities while terrorizing their targets. They had studied metallurgy, human anatomy, and the psychology of fear with the precision of military strategists. What do you think is really happening here? Share your theories in the comments about how a small group could orchestrate such precise revenge while avoiding detection for months. The third victim was Robert Blackwood, Marcus's younger brother, who oversaw the brutal punishment system that kept enslaved people working despite deadly conditions. His death in January 1717 marked a turning point because it occurred inside the main house itself, in a small furnace used to heat Marcus Blackwood's private study. The discovery was made by Marcus himself, who found his brother's body positioned as if he'd been reading by the fire when somehow fell forward into the flames. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed the impossible nature of Robert's death. The body showed evidence of restraint marks on the wrists and ankles, suggesting he had been tied before being burned. More disturbing, chemical analysis of the ash around the furnace indicated the presence of plant compounds unknown to colonial medicine, but consistent with African paralytic agents. Someone had drugged Robert Blackwood, bound him, and then slowly fed him into flames while he remained conscious but unable to move. Marcus Blackwood finally contacted Charleston authorities after his brother's death, but colonial law enforcement was ill-equipped to investigate crimes involving enslaved people as perpetrators rather than victims. Sheriff William Thompson arrived with 3 deputies, but their investigation focused on external threats rather than the possibility of organized internal resistance. They never considered that the coal tunnels they walked through daily provided perfect access to every building on the property. Meanwhile, Amina's network expanded their operations. They had learned to use the plantation's own systems of control against their oppressors. The bell system used to signal work shifts became a communication network. The tool distribution system allowed them to move weapons and restraints without suspicion. Most importantly, they had discovered that several overseers suffered from heavy drinking habits that made them easy targets for drugging and abduction. The 4th death occurred in February 1717, but this time witnesses saw part of what happened. Henry Morrison, the most brutal of the overseers, was dragged from his quarters in the middle of the night. 3 enslaved people later testified under torture that they saw figures moving to the coal tunnels, carrying something heavy toward the main furnace complex. Morrison's screams were heard for over an hour before silence fell over the plantation. When Morrison's body was discovered, it told a story of calculated revenge that went beyond simple murder. He had been burned in stages, with evidence suggesting his captors had repeatedly pulled him from the flames, allowed him to regain consciousness, then resumed the process. Dr. Whitmore's private notes describe a body bearing the marks of systematic torture designed to maximize psychological terror rather than achieve quick death. The message was clear. This was not random violence, but methodical justice. Marcus Blackwood's letters to Charleston authorities became increasingly desperate. "We face an enemy that moves through our walls like smoke through stone," he wrote to Governor Charles Craven. "They know our habits, our fears, our weaknesses better than we know ourselves. This is not mere rebellion, but something approaching warfare, conducted with surgical precision." The colonial government's response revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what they faced. Governor Craven sent additional patrols and imposed a harsh curfew on enslaved people, but these measures only provided Amina's network with more predictable schedules to exploit. The authorities assumed they were dealing with outside agitators or runaway slaves, never suspecting that the most dangerous enemies were the people who served their meals, tended their fires, and maintained their tools. Thank you for staying with us through this disturbing account. The most shocking revelations are still coming, as we uncover how Amina's network began targeting multiple victims simultaneously while avoiding detection by increasingly paranoid authorities. By March 1717, the death toll had reached 7, with each murder demonstrating increasing sophistication and psychological warfare. The pattern was becoming clear to those willing to see it. Every victim had been specifically chosen for their role in the plantation's system of brutality. But what authorities failed to recognize was that Amina wasn't just eliminating individual oppressors. She was dismantling the entire structure of control that kept the plantation functioning. The 5th through 7 victims died within a single week, an escalation that sent shockwaves through the colonial plantation system. Dr. Whitmore's medical reports described 3 different methods of execution, each tailored to the specific crimes of the victim. Jonathan Hayes, who specialized in breaking the spirits of newly arrived Africans, was found with his hands and feet burned away while the rest of his body remained untouched. Peter Williams, responsible for separating families as punishment, was discovered burned in the exact center of his body, with his extremities preserved as if to emphasize the division he had created in others. Most disturbing was the death of Samuel Morrison, Henry's brother, who had designed the plantation's punishment devices. His body was found arranged in a mockery of his own torture contraptions, burned into the exact positions he had forced enslaved people to endure during whippings and brandings. The symbolism was unmistakable. These weren't random killings, but a systematic reversal of the plantation's power structure. Private letters between plantation families revealed a growing panic among South Carolina's slave-owning class. Elizabeth Hartwell wrote to her sister, "The Negroes watch us now with eyes that see through our souls. They know our secrets, our movements, our fears. We are prisoners in our own homes, guarded by those we thought we controlled." The psychological impact was exactly what Amina had planned, the complete inversion of who held real power on the plantation. But Amina's most brilliant strategy was her use of the plantation's own record-keeping systems against its owners. She had learned to read by observing Marcus Blackwood's correspondence, and she used this knowledge to forge work orders that moved her people into position for each attack. She could reassign coal delivery schedules to place Kofi in the right tunnels at the right times. She could modify maintenance requests to ensure Samuel had access to the specific furnaces needed for each execution. The plantation's efficiency became the instrument of its own destruction. The breakthrough in understanding came when Dr. Whitmore examined the furnaces themselves and realized they had been systematically modified over months. Someone with advanced metallurgical knowledge had altered the airflow systems to create chambers capable of controlled burning. The modifications were so sophisticated that they actually improved the furnace's efficiency while creating spaces perfect for prolonged torture. Whoever was responsible possessed technical knowledge that surpassed most colonial metalworkers. Marcus Blackwood's final letter to Charleston, written in March 1717, reveals his growing understanding of what he faced. "We are not dealing with simple revolt, but with an enemy who has turned our own instrument of control into weapons against us. They know our systems better than we do because they built them, maintained them, operated them while we remain ignorant of their true capabilities." The 8th death marked a turning point because it occurred in broad daylight, witnessed by multiple people who were powerless to intervene. Timothy Crawford, son of the earlier victim William, was working near the main furnace when he simply disappeared into the flames. Witnesses described seeing him talking to one of the enslaved women, then walking voluntarily toward the furnace before suddenly screaming and falling forward into the fire. Later investigation revealed that Timothy had been drugged with a paralytic agent that left him conscious, but unable to control his movements. The woman he'd been talking to was Asha, one of Amina's core conspirators, who had perfected the art of administering precise doses of plant-based compounds that incapacitated victims without rendering them unconscious. They wanted their targets to experience every moment of their deaths, while understanding exactly why they were dying. The 9th and 10th deaths occurred simultaneously, demonstrating the network's ability to coordinate complex operations across multiple locations. Both victims were found in separate furnaces on opposite ends of the plantation, killed at precisely the same time using identical methods. This coordination required a level of planning and communication that colonial authorities couldn't comprehend. They were looking for a single perpetrator when they faced an organized resistance movement operating with military precision. By April 1717, the remaining overseers and plantation family members lived in constant terror. They slept in groups, traveled only in daylight, and refused to go anywhere near the furnace operations that formed the economic heart of the plantation. But their precautions were useless because Amina's network controlled every aspect of the plantation's infrastructure. They could cut off heat to specific rooms, redirect smoke to create confusion, or simply wait for their targets to make the inevitable mistakes that fear creates. If you're still watching at this point, prepare yourself for the final phase of Amina's plan. What happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, justice, and revenge in colonial America. The discovery that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Marcus Blackwood's own house slave, a woman named Ruth who had been secretly documenting the Resistance Network's activities. Her testimony, extracted under torture after she was caught passing information to Charleston authorities, revealed the true scope of Amina's operation and the horrifying extent of their final plan. Ruth's confession, preserved in colonial court records that were sealed for over 3 centuries, describe a network that extended beyond the Blackwood plantation to include enslaved people from 5 neighboring properties. Amina hadn't just organized a revolt. She had created an interplantation intelligence network that shared information, resources, and coordinated timing. The plan was to eliminate all major slave owners in the region simultaneously, creating a power vacuum that would allow for a general uprising. The most chilling revelation from Ruth's testimony was the discovery of Amina's detailed records hidden in the cold tunnels beneath the plantation. These documents, written in a combination of English and Yoruba symbols, contained precise maps of every plantation in the region, detailed profiles of each target, and timetables for their elimination. Amina had been planning not just revenge but revolution, using the furnace murders as both elimination of enemies and psychological warfare to terrorize the remaining slave owners into submission. Marcus Blackwood's final week alive was documented in letters he wrote hourly to Charleston authorities, creating a real-time record of his psychological deterioration. "They are in the walls," he wrote on April 15th. "I hear them moving through passages I never knew existed, speaking in tongues I cannot understand, planning horrors I can only imagine." His last coherent letter described seeing Amina herself standing in his study, watching him write, making no effort to hide her presence because she knew he was already dead. The confrontation came on April 18th, 1717, when colonial militias surrounded the plantation in an attempt to capture the resistance network. But Amina had anticipated this response and turned it into the final stage of her plan. As soldiers entered the plantation grounds, explosions rocked the main furnace complex. Amina's network had spent months preparing the furnaces for a massive detonation that would kill everyone in the main compound, while creating enough chaos for surviving enslaved people to escape into the surrounding swamplands. The explosion was heard 15 miles away in Charleston, and the fire burned for 3 days. When colonial authorities finally entered the ruins, they found a scene that defied comprehension. 14 bodies were recovered from what remained of the furnace complex, but they had been arranged in a perfect circle around a central furnace that continued burning despite having no visible fuel source. Chemical analysis of the scene revealed traces of compounds unknown to colonial science, substances that seemed to burn without consuming themselves. Marcus Blackwood's body was found at the center of the circle, but the condition of his remains suggested he had been kept alive during the explosion, experiencing every moment of the furnace complex's destruction while being slowly consumed by flames that seemed to target him specifically. Dr. Whitmore's final report described burns that followed anatomical patterns impossible to achieve through conventional fire, as if the flames themselves had been guided by intimate knowledge of human anatomy and pain response. But the most disturbing discovery was the absence of Amina's body. Her iron shackles were found, melted and twisted into shapes that resembled African spiritual symbols, but no human remains could be definitively identified as hers. Some witnesses reported seeing a figure walking to the flames unharmed, directing the destruction with gestures that seemed to control the fire itself. Others claimed to have seen her leading a group of escapees into the swamplands, disappearing into terrain where colonial militias feared to follow. The official records state that the Blackwood plantation fire was caused by industrial accident resulting from improper furnace maintenance. All mentions of organized resistance were removed from colonial documents, and families of the victims were quietly compensated in exchange for their silence about the true nature of the deaths. The colonial government's response revealed their terror at the implications of Amina's success. If enslaved people could organize such sophisticated resistance, the entire plantation system was vulnerable. In the months following the Blackwood Plantation's destruction, similar incidents occurred throughout South Carolina and Georgia. Plantation owners died in furnace-related accidents that bore unmistakable similarities to Amina's methods. Each death was accompanied by the sound of iron chains dragging across floors, heard by multiple witnesses but never explained by authorities. The pattern suggested that Amina's network had survived and spread, carrying her knowledge and methods to enslave people across the colonial South. The psychological impact on the slave-owning class was profound and lasting. Private letters between plantation families reveal a fundamental shift in how they viewed their human property. Elizabeth Morrison wrote to her cousin in 1718, "We thought we owned them, but they know us in ways we never imagined. They see our weaknesses, our fears, our mortality. We are not masters but prisoners of our own cruelty, and they hold the keys to ourselves." By 1720, the Blackwood Plantation site was completely abandoned, and the surrounding area became known as Dead Furnace Hollow among local populations. Travelers reported hearing the sound of hammering on metal echoing through the ruins on moonless nights, always followed by the dragging of heavy chains across stone. Temperature readings taken at the site consistently showed anomalies that modern science cannot explain, with certain areas remaining significantly warmer than the surrounding environment despite having no apparent heat source. Contemporary paranormal investigators who have studied the site report electromagnetic anomalies consistent with intense metalworking activity, despite the absence of any functional equipment. Thermal imaging reveals hot spots that correspond exactly to locations where Amina's victims died, suggesting that some residual energy from those deaths continues to manifest 3 centuries later. The story of Amina and the Blackwood Plantation represents one of the most sophisticated and successful acts of resistance in colonial American history, yet remains largely unknown because colonial authorities were so successful in suppressing the evidence. Her use of technical knowledge, psychological warfare, and coordinated organization created a template for resistance that threatened the fundamental assumptions of the slavery system. But perhaps the most important aspect of Amina's legacy is what it reveals about the agency and intelligence of enslaved people who have been systematically erased from historical narratives. Her story demonstrates that resistance took many forms, some far more sophisticated and effective than the simple revolts typically described in history books. She turned the instruments of oppression into weapons of liberation, using the very systems designed to control her people as the means of their oppressors' destruction. The final mystery remains: what happened to Amina after the plantation's destruction? Oral traditions among certain African-American communities in South Carolina speak of a woman who could walk through fire without burning, who taught others the secrets of iron and flame, and who continued to appear at plantations where enslaved people suffered the worst abuse. These stories, dismissed by historians as folklore, describe incidents remarkably similar to the documented deaths at Blackwood Plantation. Whether Amina survived the furnace explosion or became something else entirely, her legacy endures in the collective memory of a people who understood that sometimes justice requires methods that terrify those who profit from injustice. Her story reminds us that the enslaved were not passive victims, but active agents of their own liberation, capable of resistance as sophisticated and terrifying as the systems that oppressed them. The sound of chains dragging across stone still echoes through the ruins of Blackwood Plantation on certain nights, according to local residents who continue to avoid the area after dark. Perhaps it's merely the wind moving debris through the collapsed tunnels. Or perhaps some forms of resistance are so powerful they transcend the boundaries between life and death, continuing to haunt those who would profit from human suffering long after their original targets have turned to ash. And don't miss our next video. Subscribe to the channel and enter the placelet and follow other stories so intriguing and frightening like this. Click on the screen to watch it now.